Okay, everyone, it's last day of term, and that is literally what's happening. It's the last day in the Lords. They're then off for a recess, and I won't be back in the Lords until the 5th of September. What have I learned since I've been there? Well, a few things that have happened this week bring certain things to the fore, so I'll share those with you. The first thing to say is that it's the last day of term, and I felt, yesterday. Well, I think I've learnt quite a lot. I'm part of the Lords, and I'm trying to do a good job. And then I bumped into some people last night, and they said, "Oh, there's so many parties on, aren't there, in Parliament, in the Lords and the Commons? Which ones are you going to?" And I thought, oh, I've not been invited to any. So I think we can safely say that I'm not yet an insider in the Lords. It's probably a great relief. I didn't even want to go to the parties, but the point was I suddenly thought, oh yes, I'm still an outsider, absolutely. But I was also reminded of that in a rather unpleasant way yesterday when I was I wasn't balloted for, the discussion around Lord Frost's, David Frost's report on the Northern Irish Protocol, which actually I was very impressed with, and a lot of people who voted Brexit, there's not very many of us in the House of Lords, but really thought he'd done a good job of pushing back against the EU's real intransigence and their inability to deal with the Northern Irish situation in the way the protocol is effectively treating the peoples of Northern Ireland as though they're still in the EU and therefore not in the UK. Whatever you think about that, in the long term, the point is, for now, as the UK voted to leave the EU, it's an atrocious situation. So Frost does a good job. Lots of people spoke. And I was sitting in the place that I have sat in for 8 or 9 months. And I said "hear, hear" several times. And a couple of what can only be described as burly Labour lords immediately said, "How dare you? Get over there! What are you doing sitting here anyway?" And they said it out loud, really loud. And I said, "What are you talking about? This is where I sit," I said pathetically. And they said, "You shouldn't be here. Get over there. You are not allowed in. These are Labour benches, and disgraceful and disgusting." And I immediately responded, having been shaken up, by saying something like, "Oh, you're just stop bullying me," because I couldn't think of what else to say. And then when Kate Hoey made a contribution over Zoom, said, "Guilty woman." And I said, "Yeah, we're all guilty women." So I started getting a bit feisty then. And then at the end, because I really was shaken, I'm not doing it credit because it went on for a while. And this was in the chamber and it was embarrassing and horrible. At the end, I said, "Anyway, you're not allowed to sit there. It's gone back to normal now." Of course, it hasn't gone back to normal. They were saying this through masks, by the way, but they've removed the sign, so there's no social distancing. So they're saying, "You're not allowed to sit here." And I asked where I was meant to sit as a non-aligned. And they said, "Anyway you want, but not here. Go over to the Tories." So my only good thing that I said was, "Let me point out, I am one of the millions of Labour Leave voters. This is the Labour benches. The fact that you don't even know that there are millions of Labour Leave voters is exactly why your party's in a state." That was my big reply. But I can't tell you how uncomfortable it was. And the reason I'm saying that was because I panicked and thought, am I sitting in the wrong place? Is this the wrong, I don't really know what I'm doing. So I suppose political bullying goes on all the time. Who cares? The Labour Party Remainers were absolutely vile to everybody in the party that voted Leave, and the working class in particular, who they treated as backwoodsmen and xenophobes and all the rest of it. So I shouldn't be surprised by that. But I suppose it's just that way that people use their swagger, even on the Labour side, or maybe especially on the Labour side, to put you in your place and make you feel little. And I made a resolution last night, because I was still shaken about it, that I wouldn't let that happen again. It's not that I want to be in the Lords, but my God, I'm as entitled as anyone else. And none of us are entitled to be there. It's an unelected chamber, and therefore we are only there through appointment. And the truth is, none of us are more equal than anyone else. And I won't let that happen again to me. I spoke a lot over the week about some of the illiberal interventions by the government on vaccines, and I wanted to just explain how process works a little, because I've got myself in a tangle. I spoke in the issue of mandatory vaccines for care workers, a very difficult moral discussion which I introduced last week in Inside the Lords. So I won't rehearse it, and I spoke about it so you can look at the speech. But what you maybe are not aware of, and I realised myself that it was a difficult thing to explain because the processes are so arcane, is that when it comes to secondary legislation and statutory instruments, when they come to the House of Lords, there's never a vote on them. But what had happened was there was a regret motion put in by the Labour Party, which was to regret that this move had been brought forward without proper, evidence, without it should have been delayed and so on. But effectively, that regret motion accepted the premises that there should be mandated vaccination of care home staff, and therefore, when it came to the vote, I couldn't vote for it. I couldn't vote for a regret motion that was only a regret motion and they didn't oppose it. And there was no opportunity to vote against. So when I put this up on Twitter, I said I abstained, which immediately meant that I was attacked by everybody on the lockdown skeptic side. It was a kind of pile-on of people saying, "You coward, and I spent, many an hour answering them, explaining this situation. And I do understand it's an arcane process that people think, well, why didn't you vote against? But there was no opportunity to vote against. That is the reality. But the reason I'm saying that is because there was a hysterical response to me, and I wanted to kind of make an appeal that really people have got to just dial down the hysteria, because no one is going to win an argument that way. And I'm particularly concerned that all of the discussions now on all sides of this are focusing in on vaccines. The government started it, of course, by basically saying the vaccines were the answer. And I, who am the most enthusiastic supporter of these vaccines, not just vaccines, these vaccines, that does not mean that you then abandon any of the conversation apart from the vaccines. And the problem now has been that the people who are opposing the government's broadly on the way that illiberalism and freedom has been taken away by lockdown measures have focused on basically arguing against the vaccines. Now, it sometimes takes the form of being against mandated vaccines or against vaccine passports, which have, again, atrociously been introduced by the government, sneaked through the back door on Freedom Day of all days, and I spoke against that yesterday. But it's not all about vaccines, right? If the government say you can only have your freedom on the price of vaccine, can we all stop talking about vaccines and start talking about freedom? Because what's happened is we've enabled the anti-vaccination movement to really gain some ground. I understand vaccine hesitancy, and particularly young people and people who work in care homes are often young women, because, it's been linked, the vaccines have been linked to questions of fertility. There's all sorts of issues for people from ethnic minorities about the state telling them they've got to have a medical procedure, which you can understand them going, possibly not. And then the government have stupidly done things like said, if you don't, we'll force you, through vaccine passports or coercion. And now that's what's happened in care homes. The problem is that makes people even more suspicious of the vaccine. It makes them harden their position and so on. So I understand all that. And I really genuinely think that young people who don't want to take the vaccine, who are not at threat from COVID-19, have a point in saying we shouldn't be forced to. I'd then still like to encourage them, and I would like to have a much more enthusiastic social solidarity aspect to arguing for the vaccine. But vaccines are not the end of this story, and all of those people who only concentrate on vaccine, on the anti-vax or the anti-vaccine or the pro-vaccine side, are really missing the bigger picture. And we've got to move away from only discussing society through COVID eyes, whichever side we're on, which is why I'm so glad that the Battle of Ideas Festival on the 31st of July are open for debate. It actually moves away from that, even though in fact I will, in my little introduction, comment on the vaccines. But I also think we've got to give people credit and trust people a lot more, and not always see the most malign motives and constantly kind of bickering amongst ourselves, because it's really unhelpful. Final thing, I talked about being bullied by some of the Labour Remainers, but I do want to say as my final thought at the end of term, I've been there 9 months, and I am about to go in and discuss a report on public services, which I sat down with a heavy heart to read, thinking it would be as dull as dishwater, and it's utterly brilliant, and the Public Services Committee to be commended for that. When I say brilliant, I agree with it. It's just absolutely clear as a bell, really great evidence. And that's a little bit like my experience of my fellow peers. A lot of them were hostile when I arrived. They'd read terrible things about me on social media, in the newspapers, and they were hostile or frosty or what have you. But over a period of time, I hope that I've won the respect of some of them, at least, that I'm prepared to put the work in. But actually, they've earned my respect as well, to be fair. I mean, there's some fantastic fantastic parliamentarians in there who kind of do the job, and try and do the job in good faith. And even though they're very pro the Lords and I'm not, and we don't agree politically, I have respect for hard work and I have respect for people who act in good faith. That is not the front bench of any of the parties, by the way, but individual peers. And I'd like to thank them, not that they're watching, but for their generosity in making me feel welcome and putting up with my slightly eccentric and mistakes that I've made. But also, I am not the usual peer and I say what I think. And they're not used to that, and I know that, but they have coped, broadly speaking. It's also the case that one thing I will come back to when I come back in September was that there is still this issue hanging over two Lords who have been properly disciplined by being excluded from the coffee shops and the bars and so on for not doing that valuing everyone course. And I just want to say how infantilising it is that the Lords has let that happen. Lord Cormac forced a vote to his credit on this because we weren't due one. And there was 100 peers who voted against them being disciplined in this utterly condescending way, which, by the way, does absolutely nothing to prevent people from being harassed, which is what its aim is. And so that's my final thought, really, which is there are people who are prepared to. Lord Cormac and his colleagues didn't need to make a fuss about that, and they did, and it was right that they did so. In the meantime, today, there will be an irritating discussion on the government's strategy against violence and harassment of girls and women, which actually is going to end up criminalising a lot of behaviours which might be unpleasant or irritating or even antisocial but shouldn't be crimes. And there will be more virtue signalling going on about women and the terrible slippage of using the tragedy and the absolutely vile murder and rape of Sarah Everard to kind of have a go at people who wolf whistle and make that a kind of slippery slope argument. And at the same time, the House of Lords way of dealing with sexual harassment is to force everyone to go on a stupid course called Valuing Everybody, which, having done it, I can tell you, would teach you nothing about sexual harassment. It just shows you that politics should be done one-to-one, face-to-face. We should talk to each other if there's a problem of sexual harassment. We should talk to each other if women are being harangued in any way. We do not need these formalised reports and courses. And so when I come back after the summer to the Lords, I'm going to try and bring another dose of real life back in there as much as I can. But of course I'm not going anywhere because real life is where I inhabit, where I live, and the Lords is my second job and also not my real life. So I will be keeping in touch with everyone via the Academy of Ideas, but this is me signing off from inside the Lords.